Hi everyone, in this lecture we are going to be talking about measurement. So first of all, what do we mean by measurement? Well, the book's definition is something like this. It's the process of assigning numbers to observations, events, or objects. But really what we're doing when we measure something is we're quantifying it. The reason we're quantifying it is that because it facilitates studying whatever it is we want to study. So here's a very, very simple example. And suppose just for this very basic example that we're assigning a value of 1 to the response of yes, and we're assigning a value of 0 to the response of no. So the question that we're going to ask, suppose we're asking a particular client or something like that, did you binge drink yesterday? Yes or no, 1 or 0. Give the definition of binge drink, more than 4 drinks for women or 5 for men. It would be very simple for a client to answer yes or no, and very simple for us to quantify whether or not we would convert that response into a 1 or a 0. Well, so that's a very basic example, but why would we even care about asking a question like this? Well, at uh, at um, at that level, 4 drinks for women or 5 for men, there's actually an increased risk of harm. So we really don't care if people drink 3 or 4 drinks, depending on sex, but we are concerned if they drink 4 or 5 drinks, because that's where the risk of injury, the risk of harm, the risk of something happening really starts to increase. So that's just a really basic example of something we want to measure. And social workers are concerned with measuring all different kinds of things. We're concerned with measuring depression or anxiety, so clinical symptoms. We might be concerned with how many traumatic experiences a person has had. We might want to measure what a person how much what level of education they aspire to. I mean, there's a million different things we want to measure. And believe it or not, you have probably participated in measurement maybe without even knowing it. If you've ever filled out a customer satisfaction survey or something like, on a scale of, 1 to 10, how much did you enjoy your meal at Applebee's or something like that, or you've participated in measurement. We do this in all different areas of life. So most of the time, this is good news for us, there are measures that exist for what it is we want to study. And I've listed just a few of them here. So one that I use all the time is called the audit, which stands for the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test. I also use the PHQ-9, which stands for the Patient Health Questionnaire. It actually is a measure of depression. I'm going to show you it here in a second. But there's a bunch of other ones out there. The PCL, which is the PTSD checklist for DSM-5, the SIP, the BDI, the BAI. Sometimes people abbreviate those as Beck depression or Beck anxiety or something like that. But as I said, there's a bunch of them out there, and we'll talk more about how agencies use them here in a second. So agencies are using measurements to diagnose, maybe to understand how severe a problem is at baseline or at intake. So we're often measuring a client's problems when they first come to see us. Sometimes clients need to have a particular score, like a severity score, in order to even qualify for services. That's not always true, but it is sometimes. We might also use measurement to evaluate progress. So we could, partway through treatment, we could give a client that same measure and see how much they've improved or not improved. And if they haven't improved, then maybe more treatment is warranted. In my experience, most agencies have assessments that they use. If it's a mental health agency, the Beck depression, Beck anxiety are widely used. The PHQ-9 might also be used. If it's a substance use agency, things like the SIP or the ADS or the audit are often used. If you're at the VA, maybe working with veterans, the PCL might be something that's used. But most agencies have assessments that they're using, and most of the time they're using them because that's what their stakeholders want them to use, or that's what they've paid for. It is important that you know that measures might also be called assessments or scales or questionnaires or inventories. When people use that language, they're typically talking about the same thing. Now, the other thing is that uh, measures have to be scored. Now, there is a software sometimes that will do this for you, but there are lots of agencies out there still using just paper and pencil kinds of measurements, and then it's up to you to score them. Measures like the ones that I showed you here, they all have very explicit scoring instructions, and it's very easy to find. Most of the time when you find a measure like this, when you find a measure that you might want to use, you will also find scoring instructions. So it's not a mystery. Here's a very basic example. This is the PHQ-9. This is actually a very easy one to score because you just add up whatever it is a person circled for question 1 with question 2 with question 3, so on and so forth up until question 9. And then the higher the score, the more severe, or the higher the symptom, the higher the symptomatology would be. So the max, and then of course the lower the score, the fewer symptoms, the less symptomatology a person would have. So the maximum score a person could get on the PHQ-9 is a 27, and that would be if they answered 3 to all of these, all 9 kinds of responses. Sometimes things are averaged. Sometimes there are things that are reverse scored. Sometimes there are things that are subtracted. Sometimes things have to be converted. Again, those instructions will come typically with the measure. But one of the nice things about a measure, using measures like this, especially with the PHQ-9, is that we actually can get, we have the ability to make comparisons. So certain score ranges in the PHQ-9 are labeled not severe, or no cause for concern. I think that's a 10, maybe an 8 or fewer or something like that, but like 9 to 12 is minor depression, 13 to 16 I think is moderate, so on and so forth. So we have the ability to sort of make some judgments about a person's severity. So measurement, facilitates objectivity and standardization. It facilitates quantification and correspondence, helps us connect our theoretical models to the world, to the real world, that kind of thing. But really, we're measuring to be able to have a common language to be able to make comparisons either across populations or within the same person at different time points. And it's really sort of it's something that we have to do in both clinical practice and in research. So next we get to this idea of psychometrics, and so all measures have properties, and the properties are sort of called psychometrics, and underneath the umbrella of psychometrics there's sort of 2 properties that we're concerned with. The first is reliability, and the second is validity. Now, what it's important for you to know are the definitions of reliability and the definitions of validity, and that's what I've given you here on the screen. So reliability is achieving or obtaining the same or similar scores over time with the same person. So if you gave a person a PHQ-9 today, right, and let's say they scored a 20, just sort of picking things out out at random here, because that measure is reliable, and we know that from previous research, we would expect if we gave that person, the same person, the PHQ-9 in a week from now, that their score would be very similar. Might be a 19, might be a 20 or a 21, but it would be very, very close. By the same token, if we gave it to them, a month after that, we would expect that their score would be very, very similar, something around a 19, a 20, 21, that kind of thing. If a measure has validity, that's essentially asking the question, does the measure what it says it measures? So does the PHQ-9 measure depression, or does it measure something else? one of the ways I like to think about reliability and validity um, is suppose you wanted to hire a babysitter, right? If a babysitter is reliable, he or she shows up whenever it is you want them to show up, right? If you ask them to show up at 7, they're there between 6:55 and 7:05 every time that you ask them to show up. If a babysitter is actually a valid babysitter, then that person um, is actually skilled at watching children, right? They are what they say they are, and you're not hiring um, maybe a person to mow your lawn, or a person to work on your car, right? They're not in some other kind of profession. Reliability and validity are statistical studies of measures, and creating measures is actually very, very difficult and takes years, and typically teams of people and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of respondents. Um, I've done a couple of measure studies in my past, and we've been able to study reliability. We've been able to study different kinds of validity. It's always a good thing to do because those papers get cited a lot, and that's good for a person's career. But as I said, what you need to know is what the definitions of reliability and validity are. Um, you don't need to necessarily concern yourself with the different kinds of validity. There's a bunch. There's even more than what's listed here. But you should know that validity is referring to the extent to which a measure measures what it says it measures and not something else. Then, of course, reliability is obtaining the same or very similar scores over the course of time. If you ever read in an article that measures had acceptable psychometrics or good psychometrics or something like that, that simply means that it performed reliably and with validity. Then there's this thing called measurement error. And measurement error is very sort of a difficult concept, because we can't often measure things like symptoms completely 100% objectively, because we're measuring thoughts and behaviors and thought patterns and things like that. There's always a difference between the observed score, which would be the score obtained on the measure, and the actual or the true score. Here's the thing that makes this so difficult. The true score is actually completely unknown. It's a theoretical idea. And so the measurement error is simply the difference between the score that was observed or actually obtained on the measure and then the actual or the true score. The bottom line is that we want measurement error to be as small as possible, and that's why creating measures takes years and years and years of work and lots of different trials. It's all because we're trying to make measurement error as small as possible. It generally comes from not asking what we need to ask, not providing enough options. It comes from participants, having trouble remembering things or wanting to mislead us, or error might even be completely random, which is just something else. But as I said, bottom line is that we want error to be as small as possible. Most of the time, as I said, when you work in an agency, they have a package of measures that they use that sort of correspond to the work that it is they're doing. For your capstones, you may need to locate a measure. We'll talk about how you can do that in a second. But in general, my advice to you would be to use a standardized measurement instrument, which I've given you a bunch here, and there's literally hundreds more out there. But as I said, the good news is that for most of the constructs that we want to measure, there are measures that exist already. There's lots of advantages. It's convenient, it's easy. It creates normative data, so it lets us make interpretations about scores. So scores are healthy or not, nothing to be concerned about, or scores that sort of warrant attention. And it also facilitates comparisons and stuff like that. So when you look at these different measures, there's a number of different response categories, and this is something you should probably know. So the first response category is this continuum, which is sometimes called a Likert scale. Likert was a name of the man who actually developed these. So the classic Likert scale is the range of responses from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we might assign each of those different options a 1, a 2, or 3, or 4, just like I've done here. Another idea about a continuum is never, what I've listed on the left here, never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, or always. And of course, I've assigned kind of arbitrarily different numbers to those different categories. So one of the question you might use for this never to always continuum might be something like how often do you fight with your spouse or significant other, right? Person that answers never or rarely, probably not a whole lot to be concerned about, but a person who answers occasionally, frequently, or always might be something, to worry about. Similarly, if we were to do, strongly disagree to strongly agree, it might be something like, I am satisfied with the services I am receiving from, my social worker. Strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? Strongly disagree is sort of cause for concern, but agree or strongly agree is sort of what we want, or a desirable score. Question always comes up is, what about neutral? And that really depends on what it is you're trying to ask. I'm not always a big fan of neutrals because it's sort of a middle ground. It doesn't really tell us much. At least if you do 4 categories, disagree and agree, it forces a person into a positive side or a negative side. But again, that really depends on the kind of information that you're going for. How long should measures be? It's really hard to say. The PHQ-9 is only 9 questions. It's very easy, very convenient for participants to do. Only takes a couple of minutes. The PCL-5 is, I believe, 20 questions, so it takes a little bit longer. There are some measures out there. One is called the Brief Symptom Inventory. That's, I think, something like 60 questions long, so it actually takes quite a while to do. Typically, the longer a measure is, the better psychometrics it will have, and the sort of more things that you can ask about. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that longer measures are more difficult for participants to answer. We call that response burden. People get tired, they get bored, they get frustrated. They sometimes will stop answering the measure completely, and then we don't have data. Or sometimes they'll just start circling things, or pressing buttons on an iPad or iPhone or something like that at random, and then we've got lousy measurements, we've got bad measurements. So shorter measures are good, but at the risk of psychometrics. Here's a couple of other rating scales to talk about. These are sort of goes along with a couple of slides ago. So we have graphic rating scales. So on a scale from 1 to 10, how calm or anxious were you? I've seen these done as 0 to 100 before, but it really sort of depends on what you're after. An itemized rating scale, it might be used to ask about something like race or ethnicity. So on an itemized rating scale, you wouldn't be able to say that one response is better than the other. It's just different categories of things. So what is your ethnicity? Hispanic or non-Hispanic is sort of a really basic example. We could ask about religion the same way. So what's your religion? And then we would list, all of the different religious preferences. And again, we couldn't say that one of those categories is better or worse than the other. So that's a good example of an itemized rating scale. We could ask about race. We could ask about sex or gender. We could ask about sexual orientation, sort of all the same way, using an itemized rating scale. Comparative rating scales. So that's where you would give instructions like put the following types of dessert in order of preference. So if you were me, you might list ice cream first, cake second, chocolate bar third, a fruit pie fourth, and pudding fifth. So you would use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to sort of indicate your preference. Someone else might answer obviously completely different, but that's a comparative rating scale. A self-anchored scale is actually very similar to a graphic rating scale, but we actually give participants a little bit less information. So suppose I were to, ask a question like, to what extent are you nervous about the exam? 1 through 10, with 1 being not nervous and 10 being very nervous. Right, scale from 1 to 10. How satisfied were you with your meal at Red Lobster tonight? Right, something like that. Scale from 1 to 10. How much are you craving pizza? Right, all kinds of different things you could ask about, but it's up to the person to sort of assign a meaning to the different numbers in the scale there. Then there's this semantic differentiation. You don't see this an awful lot in social work, but put it up there just for the sake of completeness. So it might be instructions like below are words that are used to describe a Ford truck, just sort of picking things at random. Circle the response that most closely captures your opinion of a Ford. Ugly or beautiful, fast or slow, strong or weak. People do this all the time with like brand perception. So what are your opinions of Netflix or something like that, and they'll have words like innovative on one side and outdated on the other. They'll have words like exciting or boring, on one or the other. And that's really just to get sort of the closely capture someone's opinion. Then, excuse me. Then there's this thing called goal attainment scales, and I had to take this out of the book because I actually couldn't find one. I see these. Used to see these a lot working in schools, where there often were a couple of different behaviors that people were working on with students. So you have in here you have sort of 3 different scales. The first scale corresponds to weight. The second scale corresponds to isolation, and the third corresponds to behavior. And so if a person maybe lost some weight, but and didn't spend very much time alone, and had very few behavior problems, there would be a high score, and that might allow that student to earn a prize, or something like that. And by the same token, if the student maybe gained weight but didn't spend a lot of time alone, and didn't have behavior problems, that those would offset the weight gain, and so maybe there would still be some points that were earned, and a smaller prize is earned, or something like that. So it's a way to sort of think about rewarding people for different combinations of behavioral outcomes, and sort of think about different multiple behavioral options at the same time. So where do you find measures? They are all over the internet. They're in journal articles. Occasionally you can ask publishers. People put them on websites. If you can find it, you are able to use it, particularly for a school project. If you were doing funded research, or doing research as a PhD, the rules might be different, but for your capstone, if you can find it, you can use it. There are measures out there that you have to pay for, and there are often measures out there that you have to pay lots of money for. People do that because they have to recoup the cost of developing those measures. There is sort of no circumstance where you would need to pay for a measure for your capstone. So if that ever is the case, you have a construct that you want to measure, and you're running into a paywall, let me know, and I can help you come up with an alternative. But again, if you can find it, you can use it. And then, of course, why use a standardized measure? You could create your own measure as part of your capstone if you wanted to, but that's going to add significantly to your workload. So we typically use standardized measures because they have established reliability and validity. They're widely used in other studies. So in my field, sort of the alcohol treatment field, we are often, everyone uses the audit, everyone uses another measure called the SIP, and everyone uses another measure called the ADS. And the reason that I use them as well is that lets me compare my conclusions with what others have found. So absolutely to our advantage to use sort of standardized measures. So that's everything. Hope this was helpful. Feel free to ask questions. As always, take care.